Let's take a look at linq. My understanding is that the proper pronunciation is linq. I'm going to call it linq, however, which a lot of people do. I just can't get myself to actually say linq. Linq stands for Language Integrated Query. And what that means is we can put query in code rather than using SQL strings. And the first time I ever saw this, and I imagine a lot of people's first reaction, and still have that reaction, is that putting any kind of query language within code is not necessarily a good idea. And there's certainly that point of view. You might argue, however, that SQL is going to be in code. Whether you put it in a stored procedure or a view, you're still going to end up calling that stored procedure or view, and quite often, you're going to just be putting in straight SQL anyway. It may be down in your data layer in the right place, but it's still going to be some sort of query language. So you can use linq instead of using SQL, and the benefit that it gives you is that it's compiled. So you'll get compiler warnings and error messages as opposed to having to wait to runtime to see that you mistyped some SQL. Or worse, that you don't get an error and the query just doesn't do exactly what you thought it did. Linq also has an advantage in that it doesn't necessarily require a database. It requires an IEnumerable or iQueryable interface on the object that we're working on. So we can work on data context tables, which are going to be typically business objects, or we can work on data tables from a database, which is more like what we would use SQL on, but we can also work on arrays and lists and XML docs. So linq is very flexible in the types of objects that it can work with. There are actually two syntax forms for linq. The first is a query expression syntax, and it looks a bit more like SQL, sort of with the old HP calculator notation. So we have a select statement here, but instead of the first keyword being select, we start with the from clause. So I say from order in orders, where, and this is going to be the where clause, where order ID is equal to 25, select order. And at the end of that select statement, we can actually create objects so that we select an order and then create a new object based on that order if we want to. So it's a little bit of a funny notation if you're more used to straightforward SQL, but it is still of that form. The other form of syntax is a standard dot notation syntax, where we have orders, which is going to be our collection that we've already established, and dot where, and this is where we create the where clause, and we use a lambda expression for that where clause. So our order ID has to equal 25, and then dot select, and we again use a lambda expression. In this case, we're going to return all of our orders. Linq also provides us one other difference than we might see in SQL. It has the idea of a deferred result. And a deferred result means that we have the statement in code, but the actual query isn't executed until the collection is enumerated. So we can establish the linq statement, but it's not run right then when the linq statement is established in code. It's not actually run until we take a look at the result collection. So that means that the updates to data are reflected in the results. So if we've created a linq statement, perhaps at the beginning of our class construction, but we don't actually enumerate the collection until a user has some sort of action input to us, the user is going to get the benefit of any updates that happened from other threads or other users on that data, because the actual query of the data wasn't run until that user action. So that means the data is as fresh as it can be. We're going to take a look at the number of the linq methods. In the table will indicate whether the results are deferred or not. So linq has a lot of methods, and I just thought I would take a look at some of them, and you can go through the table and take a look at the documentation for the others. The all method is going to return true if all the items in the source data match the predicate, in other words, the where clause. And any correlates to all a bit, but it will return true if at least one of the items in the source matches the predicate. So this is sort of an and or an or logic. We also have a contains method, an account method, and a first method, and those are all fairly self-explanatory. And because none of those actually return an enumerable collection, none of them are deferred. You'll probably use first or default really often. First or default is similar to the first method in that it returns the first item from a data source, or if there aren't any items, it will return no items. The first method that does not have a default will throw an error if there are no items. And then, of course, we have last or default. And we also have min or max. And that will return either the smallest or the largest value specified by a lambda expression. So these are all fairly simple and obvious from the method names. We also can do order bys. And order bys, by default, are ascending, and we can use the keyword descending as well to reverse that, same as you would in SQL. And that is one of our deferred queries, because it actually does return an IEnumerable. It returns a collection of objects that we're ordering. And there's a reverse method that reverses the order of items. And probably the one that you'll use the most is the select. And we already had that in our example. It simply returns a result set from a query. Single and singular default are also methods that you'll probably use a lot, because they'll return a single item. So if you're running a query on a table, for instance, you're looking for an item based on its primary key, or some other query string and you only expect one return value, you can use single or singular default. Single will throw an exception if there are multiple matches, as will singular default. Single will also throw an exception if there are no matches, whereas singular default will return a default value. And the default value, by default, is equal to null, unless your object says otherwise. We can also find our way in collections by using skips and takes. So a skip will skip over a specified number of elements, and a take will take a specified number of elements from the start of the data. So take is a rough equivalent of a limit. So if you just wanted the top 10 results, you could do a take. We also have an aggregate function called sum, and it simply totals the values selected by the predicate. And we do have methods for converting our collections into arrays, dictionaries, or lists. And of course, we have where clauses. And along with the select, you'll probably use the where just about as often. And often in the where clause, you're using a lambda expression if you're using that dot notation. So that's an overview of linq, and I think you'll see it a lot these days in C# code, particularly if you're working with ASP.NET MVC projects.